Right, so welcome everyone. I would like to just introduce the series and then our specific session, and as well then, of course, the participants, and let them take us to a very, very good flight today. um, so the Foundation series is a series of events that I'm hosting and also conceived of, and it is part of the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale under the Italian Virtual Pavilion, as part of the Space and Planetary Design Group that was the creative directorship of Ed Keller. And the virtual Italian pavilion was curated by Tom Kovac and by Alessandro Mellis and was titled CityX Venice, in response to a major question theme of the Venice Biennale, which is curated by Ashim Sarkis. And the question is, how will we live together? So the Foundation series specifically wants to, and I am Carla Leitão, an architect. So the Foundation series wants to engage these key big questions about world making, basically exploring ideas about the grounds that we will be walking on in the future and our specific role in creating those grounds. Furthermore, because of my background and interests, I'm really interested in exploring design thinking and its role in making or shaping those foundational systems that then will ground or structure the ways in which we could all indeed live together, and for that all to be as common as possible, knowing all the difficulties that that brings. And I am going to share a So the big questions will have these particular topics. They are looking at extremely large problems and broad or even meta problems. In the token, which is our session today, we will be looking at economies and exchanges, the role of emerging tokens of exchange, specifically digital coins, in shaping the characters of future exchanges in a very, very general, again, and broad way, the word exchange. Now, as much as we may idealize or even romanticize the development of the role of writing in the production of ideas, knowledge, and memory, the first writings in history that we know of from around 3000 BC were actually contracts of legal and administrative nature in Sumeria, Mesopotamia, those civilizations and regions, which would carve in stone or in clay, in this case, the accounting of goods and services towards commercial exchanges. They very much resemble or remind us of the preoccupation with census and accounting that led to the history of computing, for example, and also of this culture as well, that is pervasive now in data mining and its interest in AI as another form of calculation and interpolation. As well, the Great Alexandria Library, also from BC, 285 to 246, supposedly, often is described like a temple of a culture that had a thirst for knowledge and an evidence of that thirst for knowledge because of a culturally driven Ptolemaic reign, which was also, in this case, the Great Library of Alexandria, was also, to a degree, very pragmatically a business center. We can understand it as such from all the records, where several scribes were translating contractual agreements into the different languages of the diverse civilization makeup of the Mediterranean. So the port of Alexandria, for instance, was an attractor in part because of these centralized services that helped formalize the commercial exchanges of the area's merchants. This is where one came to translate contracts into 3 or more other languages and get double copies. Now, digital coins as contracts, and as well the ways in which the structures or platforms that they run with became more part of the public imaginary even though they are older than this, in 2015 during this Eurozone Greek standoff, where Bitcoin was referred to by Varoufakis, at the time Minister of Finance, during a very short stint in 2015, during the government debt crisis in Greece. And Bitcoin came into the limelight as this potential alternative financial tool to the economic crisis at the center of the dispute. In fact, these alternative currencies, such as digital coins, are both attractive for their capacity to bubble up a value and be financial instruments, not much different than art markets or stocks, as well as are looked upon as tokens to support parallel economies of recirculation of values within local economies, when more global coins are inaccessible to some. So they can also be seen as temporary ideas or temporary tools or holding patterns, but so that their mutability is actually part of the stability that they would offer as well as an idea. Now, with the number of services increasingly going digital and the current explosion of the NFT concept into a multiverse of reality, there's no possible overview of branches here. The digital crypto coins facilitate the absorption or melding of previously held differences between a number of things, of categories of roughly separated universes, accelerating connections between forms of design, exchange, cultural and social form, and ultimately ideas of future. The monetization of social media, the focus on eyeballs meets its archy friend, the stock market of art, and both are brought to a boil by a virtual gaming mindset, no doubt restructured by a pandemic-simmered workforce, bringing us to the current race on speculation about futures of coins as platforms, coins as structures or services, coins as folios, coins as sentimental novels, and coins as a future itself. The NFT market explosion drew the interest of art auction dealers like Sotheby's, and some of the pieces sell now in the millions. So forget about the Creative Commons. What will we do with the word courtesy? This reminds us, of course, of so many authors like George Bataille and The Accursed Share, but as well, more recently, Benjamin Bratton, the concept of stack, the stacked layers of realities networks that we currently live in, which are more concrete than the buildings we inhabit on. But one thing we know, we love our accounting. Data is now society's companion, and we keep on using tables to keep our records safe and clear. Those tables of exchanges become by far the most concrete evidence of the communications exercise in our daily lives. And whether we like it or not, the glimpse into the futures that we strive for and actively design. Virtual exchanges have physical costs and consequences, and those costs are now measurable as well by coins themselves. So I'm very grateful to have our speakers drive us through these new grounds, or maybe fly us, show us some details and the possible futures that we can look forward to. So I'm very, very happy to welcome Jillian Crandall, who's a registered architect, urbanist, and a researcher that is investigating the effects of digital technologies on infrastructure, space, and lives. Jillian is an advocate for digital equity, spatial justice, and design justice, and she has a critical urban research and design practice Contra Plus, currently teaching as well at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute School of Architecture in Troy, New York. And Inte Gloerich is a researcher working on the politics, artistic imagination, and countercultures surrounding digital technology and economy. She has also been a co-editor of Money Lab Reader, Overcoming the Hype, with Geert Lovink and Patricia de Vries, and she currently teaches at the MA New Media and Digital Culture and the BA Media and Information at University of Amsterdam. And Xavier Balaguer Rasillo is a researcher working in the University of Zurich in the field of economic geography and its intersection with political economy, sociology, and political ecology. He is interested in how activist and grassroots groups intersect with these digital technologies and also harness it towards new futures for post-capitalist transformation. and Javier teaches human and economic geography at the University of Zurich. They will, the three of us each will be, the three of them each will be introducing us to specific aspects of this topic, and I will turn the table to them in their presentations. Thank you very much for coming.
Currency, well, it's typically understood as a digital representation of economic value, or as my colleague Koray Shaliskan puts it, data money. And as you may know, Bitcoin was the first popular cryptocurrency, not tied to any one country or nation state. But Bitcoin has since been pegged to the US dollar and has been bought, traded, and speculated. And a number of so-called stable coins have been introduced that are also tied to national currency. So what does it mean to mine cryptocurrency? Well, there's many types of blockchain, but in the most common, so including the Bitcoin blockchain, proof of work blockchain, one can elect to put their computer to work to computationally confirm transactions. And so owners are rewarded for their energy expenditure by earning cryptocurrency for being essentially the first node to confirm the transaction. And back in the day, you or I could use the leftover computing power of our laptops to hypothetically mine Bitcoin. But as of late, there's an entire industry, entire dedicated mining warehouses have been constructed, packed with these dedicated Antminer computing rigs that are just chugging away. And with that competition, the likelihood of you or I actually mining any Bitcoin from your own personal computer is slim to none, unless you pay into a mining pool, which gives you shares of the crypto mined from these warehouses. But an important shift happened in 2015 with the launch of the Ethereum blockchain, which opened up source code for developers to create their own cryptocurrencies or decentralized applications that go beyond just currency or money or speculation. And so with Ethereum, a blockchain is not just a record of transactions, but also a database or a service platform. And that data that can be represented on a blockchain via crypto coins or tokens, as we'll refer to. You may have heard of NFTs, non-fungible tokens. What these represent are virtually limitless, right? So from digital art and renderings like this one by Krista Kim, which reportedly sold for about $500,000, to digital pets or gaming like crypto kitties. But even beyond that, health records, land rights, even voting stakes in an organization. And that is a process that we'll refer to as tokenization. And then lastly, to the point of voting rights, this last term that I'll bring up is the DAO, or the Distributed Autonomous Organization, which essentially are blockchain-based governance platforms where decisions are collectively made computationally. And voting rights are typically tied to tokens and are executed via these coded smart contracts. But it's important to note that the systems can be designed under frameworks with differing degrees of democratic governance. For example, you have to ask, is it one vote per person, which might be more akin to a democratic cooperative, or is it one vote per token, meaning the more tokens a user has or owns, the more voting power they have. So in summary, what we're addressing here as a collective, I think, is that essentially the design of the protocols and the frameworks of the tool of the blockchain has everything to do with how equitable that system is. And before we each launch into our presentations, I wanted to set up some common themes. We're really building off of a concept that Rob Kitchen and Martin Dodge put forth on code space, which argues that physical space is increasingly mediated by the virtual, that virtualities are realities, placing demands and reconfiguring material geographies. And by extension, in a paper that Inte and I recently published with our colleague Pete Hausen, under crypto space, more virtual and physical things and spaces are being tokenized. And while many blockchain and crypto ventures are purportedly decentralized and distributed, empirically, we find that they actually tend to concentrate geographically and re-centralize in areas with maximum financial incentive. For example, in locations where there's favorable tax incentives, or where there's a lack of regulatory constraint, or in the case of mining warehouses, areas where electricity cost is inexpensive, for example, hydroelectric power. And in the case of foundations, which is the theme, while Bitcoin and cryptocurrency has ideological foundations in libertarianism, cyberpunk, actually contemporary rhetorics around decentralization actually galvanize different communities in ideologically different or contrasting ways. Also, distributed ledgers are built sometimes on shaky infrastructural foundations of existing internet technologies. So if equity is a concern, the digital divide is something that has to be addressed. And on the topic of equity, if blockchain opens the potential to dream new futures and new techno-economic foundations, we have to question who has the power and the privilege to dream and whose values are being encoded. And so this just opens up a number of questions already. Can we code to allow for either human or inhuman or multi-species messiness, imperfection, nuance, negotiation, and flexibility in interaction and engagement? And what other forms of value or valuation could be engaged other than those that are purely profit-driven? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Inte, and she will take us through some blockchain imaginaries.
Yes, thank you. Let me see. I will share my screen. This one. Is that coming through right? Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Let me move around my things here. Hello, my name is Inte Gloerich, and I am doing a PhD on blockchain imaginaries. So this is imaginaries is a word to describe the stories we tell around technologies in order to further their understanding or kind of shape what way they'll develop as well. So what I find interesting in these kind of imagined futures, in these imaginaries with blockchain, is that they have there's a kind of worldview embedded in them and politics that comes with them. So this is one side of the story that I want to tell today, but also I'm interested in the kind of shapes that these imaginaries take. So that's where the utopianism, mysticism, and the kind of theoretical aspects come in. So first I'll go a little bit into the history of blockchain and its politics, and then I'll show this these shapes, and I'll move a little bit from the directly applicable to more speculative projects throughout. So the history. Blockchain was kind of announced by its inventor in 2008 on a cryptography mailing list. And this was right around the time that faith in the banking system was at a historic low because of the global financial crisis that I'm sure everyone remembers. So this new cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, which blockchain is kind of the technological foundation of, was designed and framed expressly to root around those kind of incumbent financial institutions. And it replaced the trust needed in the kind of ultimately corruptible intermediaries that humans built, these institutions, with what was thought of as this trustless cryptographic proof. And all of this was invented by Satoshi Nakamoto. And we are unsure if that is a man or a woman or a group of people. This system that was developed, it facilitated, over the years, we've seen it facilitate everything from, dark web drug sales to a new host of crypto millionaires, and as well as more societal projects and some experimental art as well. But the fame that goes with it is unclaimed. We don't know who Satoshi is. And this goes well with whether that's intended or not. It kind of plays well with the anti-institutional rhetoric of the Bitcoin white paper and its enthusiasm for this supposedly apolitical computational system to facilitate these societal processes. So in a kind of godlike move, Satoshi created and then disappeared. And keeping Bitcoin supposedly immaculate conception free of the personal politics that any like one developer or human developers would bring with it. And so around 2016, 17, 18, and the blockchain hype had really grown to immense proportions, and startups proclaimed all around that they were going to disrupt any imaginable sector, from journalism to health to agriculture. Of course, finance was always there. And the term blockchain revolution was becoming more and more popular. And with all of this going on, it seems impossible at this stage to uphold the truly kind of apolitical utopian narrative of that was present in the Bitcoin beginnings. So these projects actively, work towards a future that is different and supposedly better than the present. And any change is political. It has different effects for different people. And blockchain projects, for the good or for the money, are thoroughly political. So my question then is, what kind of politics are associated with blockchain technology, and what kind of futures do people imagine with this technology? So people have done a lot of work on kind of deciphering the politics of this technology. And its roots are definitely, or one side of its roots, definitely in this kind of cypherpunk community that came up in the 80s, where privacy was a main focus. And that's also present in a lot of blockchain projects. This focus on anonymity, which works in various degrees. And also this kind of idea of techno-libertarianism. So in cryptocurrencies, a focus is definitely on kind of free market and anti-state sentiments, where people often prefer these kind of self-governing communities. And the most extreme form I've seen that described is anarcho-capitalist tendencies. And then also I've seen right-wing extremism being associated with Bitcoin particularly. But there's different degrees of all of this, of course. But a central element also to the kind of worldview that is associated with these technologies is that humans cannot be trusted, basically, because they are subjective, fallible, corruptible, and instead technological systems should be trusted to run these social processes. Because blockchain is really emphasizing this kind of rationality and scientific objectivity, putting things into an immutable ledger. So we've got this kind of privacy, libertarianism that runs from in different degrees, but also this kind of technocratic worldview present throughout many of these projects, but not all. There's also a lot of projects coming up in recent years that kind of can be gathered under the header of blockchain for good. Social or sustainability are topics that are really present there. They don't boast financial success or individual gains necessarily, but really position themselves around more ideals that are more societal, for example, UN sustainability goals, sustainable development goals, sorry. This unbridled free trade that is often kind of represented in older projects, or Bitcoin itself, is not so present in these projects. But people that have researched these projects have also kind of scratched below the surface a bit and shown that they are still kind of embedded in these neoliberal logics of individual responsibility, kind of wanting to be outside of government control, and that they end up reproducing a lot of, those neoliberal ideals, whether intended or not. And I think that's something maybe Xavier will touch upon more later as well. Now we come to the moment where I want to talk about the shapes that these imaginaries take, and I want to highlight three that I find interesting at the moment. So the first one is the kind of these utopian stories told around technologies. I think here we have to zoom in on that blockchain for good sector. So a project like Diem, which formerly was known as Libra, owned by Facebook and its partners, which is basically a cryptocurrency, backed by lots of big corporations, that tries to change the world by giving access to financial systems to those who are bankless. So that's people that, due to their financial situation or the political economic systems in their countries, don't have access to a bank account. And so this project kind of uses banklessness as a proxy for whatever is holding people back. And the logic used here is that when people can become financial humans, they will be empowered to live a better life, as it says on the screenshot there. And I agree that there are definitely situations in which it's beneficial to be able to root around particular governments. We also have to, especially after the past week, can be quite certain that Facebook will not have their partners, their users' wellness central in a project like this. So in the end, this kind of project pulls more users and more kind of people into this kind of neoliberal market-driven logics outside of the control of any government. And another side of this kind of utopian stories is also the ones that tell about a thriving planet. So a sustainability narrative. And while we hear a lot of sustainability critique about the blockchain, which is another thing, these projects came up with systems to better the climate and to help the world become more sustainable. So while of course these goals are laudable, again, when you start looking under the surface, it looks a little bit different from the systems. It looks little different actually from the systems that we already have. So for example, EcoCoin is doubling down on the choices that individuals have to buy or invest in sustainable products rather than changing something systemic. And Regen Network, which is the one from the Thriving Planet, actually reproduces this kind of system of carbon trading, but on the blockchain. So while everything they do is kind of green and super luscious and beautiful, in their system, they do little to actually limit carbon emissions. And then the second kind of shape, this mysticism that I recognize around blockchain a lot. So yeah, there's magic, astrology, spirituality, all connected to blockchain, and this kind of maybe ties into this nature of the blockchain being hard to understand or beyond explicability or understandability. And so this is just a nice cover that I actually found a few days ago, a cover of a book with witches, wizards, and aliens, I think, chanting that Bitcoin is magic. So what I find interesting in this kind of shape is that it's surrounded with these, this technology is surrounded with ideals of rationality and scientific objectivity, proof, those kind of things, yet it's also connected to these mystical elements. And for example, Maren Altman, who has a popular YouTube channel, she has 150,000 followers, where she reads the astrological chart of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Here it's Doge, for example. And here we see her explaining that currencies often drop after new moons. And yeah, she goes through all sorts of readings, and she's actually quite, every time she says this is not financial advice, but actually it sounds a lot like financial advice. So though she's making use of this kind of spiritual knowledge system, it is still in line with the rationality that blockchain favors. So faced with a highly volatile and ultimately free market, the only rationality left to interpret the signs is that of the stars. And then we see also companies kind of tying into this connection between blockchain and the spiritual. For example, High Vibe Network is a company that aims to support people in their process of self-realization and personal development, things like mindfulness and those kind of things. So the problem spaces that they address is that many people actually drop out of these processes, life takes over, and their system puts in place these kind of economic rewards for those that stick with it and expand their consciousness, as they put it. So I see this kind of as the next level of the economy that is built around mindfulness courses and yoga retreats, pulling even more of our kind of personal experiences into this economic logic through making them part of this spiritual goal that we can achieve. And then lastly, this is the kind of theoretical shape. And by that, I mean projects that are less focused on, real working products, but use blockchain more as a thinking device. So this is a project, it's a picture from a speculative artistic project called Terra Zero. And they imagine what it would be like if a forest was put on the blockchain and became self-governing. So through the blockchain, the forest would be able to accumulate wealth, sell its trees as wood and accumulate wealth, and then also buy back more land in order to grow and appropriate these kind of capitalist logics for natural expansion. And this is another project. It's a screenshot I took earlier today. So this is a project called Oblomo, also an artistic project that imagines what a future of work might look like in a crypto-infused world. So I see this kind of as a critique of crypto economy that doesn't really add value to the economy, but just sits there in minds. So this is a screenshot of their website so if you turn on your camera, you can mine coins, but you have to stay as still as possible. So the camera detects whether there's a face in the picture, and if you move, it stops mining. So it's kind of, you have to be lazy in order to make money. So I like these kind of projects that try to think through what the logics of this technology are and kind of critique with it or imagine alternatives with it. So to kind of wrap up, what was imagined as a utopian, as an apolitical project, soon gained very political dimensions, and utopian projects emphasize how the world will be different with them, but not change a lot. Mystical projects kind of seem to contradict the rationality of the blockchain, but they actually support the kind of economizing tendencies that it has, tokenizing. And these last projects do bring me hope that we can use technology also in a more theoretical yeah, frame of mind to imagine alternatives and what happens when we push these logics to the extreme. Can we come out on the other side? So my PhD is still very much in process, so I don't have all the answers yet, but I hope you enjoyed exploring these imaginaries with me. That was it.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. So I guess if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll return to them after the three of us go through our presentations, if that's good. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just emphasize that everyone can start adding questions at any moment to the chat. Yeah. Thank you so much, Inte.
Okay.
It's awesome.
Okay. Okay. Let me check. Can you see my screen? Okay. Very good. Awesome. So this is great. I think Inte gave a really great general overview of ideas and imaginaries around utopia. And I'm going to take us now into ideas about specific implementations of so-called crypto-utopias, particularly in the case of Puerto Rico, namely the Puertopia project spearheaded by Brock Pierce, but also contested by local Puerto Ricans. Now, as Inte mentioned, so-called blockchain revolution, there's certain claims around this being a radical revolutionary technology, how it's going to change the world. In some cases, it did change the world, but in many ways, blockchain has actually become a techno-capitalist industry in and of itself, engaged by IMF, the World Bank, the UN, consultancies like Deloitte and McKinsey. But as I mentioned earlier, the consequences are entirely material and spatial and, in fact, urban. And I conceptualize blockchain urbanization as a process that's enacted in service to blockchain technology and as a result of developments around blockchain. Particularly blockchain urbanism relates to the ways that blockchain is championed for use in the urban realm. So urban development, governance, transportation, public services, identity management, etc. And at present, blockchain urbanism is mostly contained to the realm of utopian desire, but several large-scale urban projects have been proposed, although few have been implemented. But I want to circle back to this idea around, as Inte brought up about, the right libertarian, cyber libertarian views. At the same time, blockchain also represents a technology that galvanizes people on the political left. And it does represent an idea about an increase in individual freedom and decentralized control and power of powerful tech corporations, including those leading today's smart city projects. This does recall, in many ways, the original promises of the Californian ideology in the 60s that imagined that the internet itself would decentralize control. And in the same way, blockchain attracts people with seemingly incompatible politics. The Californian ideology also attracts those on the political spectrum. But techno-positivists imagine that technology can facilitate a social transformation. We might also look at the aesthetics of decentralization in addition to the rhetorics. And Orit Halpern ties the development of the web to impacts on the built environment by cyberneticians and counterculturalists, designers like Buckminster Fuller, Nicholas Negroponte. So we might ask, what might become of the aesthetics of blockchain and how does it impact urbanism? And also question, is there a difference between blockchain utopian dreams in the city and this quest for a new utopia via smart cities? Logistics hubs like Cisco Songdo and Sidewalk Labs, Waterfront Toronto. Certainly corporate imaginaries, but urban visions via blockchain, on the other hand, they're not just proposed by corporations and governments, but also by these wealthy, usually generated by their crypto investments, but developers, sometimes venture capitalists, and groups with ideological intent. So what we can anticipate is the city as a product to be consumed, a city as a profit machine with bodies to commodify as data points, and also a city as a sandbox or a playground for economic and social experimentation. by blockchain developers. And in my research, I stepped back and assembled a taxonomy of spatial or blockchain utopias, first thinking about virtual worlds, right, with cryptocurrency as the basis to create virtual cities and monetize content and applications. This is Decentraland. You can actually experience this in virtual reality, but people can participate in this virtual real estate market to buy and sell parcels of virtual land, and that is the token. Literally pixels on a screen, but users could also design their own parcels with this online editor, similar to Sims or SimCity. Crypto voxels is another example. But separate from the gaming and virtual world examples, another segment of blockchain utopias are the ones that aim to remake physical lands, often initiated by governments in search of greater efficiencies, as Inte was mentioning with neoliberalism, and sometimes for economic development. And they usually involve some sort of rebranding, like Malta's blockchain island or e-Estonia, right? Meant to more efficiently facilitate citizen interactions with the state via digital citizenship, health services, and voting, all using blockchain as a platform, as a digital service platform. And so we might consider crypto nations hoping to use cryptocurrency and blockchain for economic development. On the venture capital side, we're seeing blockchain real estate investment trusts that emerge. And typically this is just an institutionalization of existing real estate investments, but touting the use of blockchain to make property shares easier to trade. And the technical architecture of this is the security token offering. So essentially, if you're familiar with the initial coin offering, this is the next iteration whereby the token is actually linked to a real world asset, such as real estate or property. So what we have now is a tokenization of space and a tokenization of housing, of hotels. The first US example is a luxury resort in Aspen, Colorado, so Aspen Coin. The minimum token purchase was $10,000 and you had to be a qualified high net worth investor. In the UK, the Smartlands project tokenized a new student housing project in Nottingham and actually used the capital to help build the project. This one, the minimum investment was only 500 British pounds, which is a bit better, but pushing this even more further to perhaps be more progressive, what would be a model that might, for example, allow students to fund their room and board during their education? Don't know. And then this one, particularly a blockchain REIT in Brazil, minimum purchase is $5,000, but to qualify, you have to prove that you are not a citizen of Brazil. And so that is a dangerous mechanism of digital colonization that may or may not be done in collaboration with the local government. Similar, where you have citizens or groups outside of government looking to establish new territories in service to crypto or blockchain. This includes the Seasteading Institute's floating ocean cities off the coast of French Polynesia, with their vision of absconding government control and taxation primarily. Anyway, kind of recalls Buckminster Fuller's geodesic domes, a cybernetic pastoral that Jonathan Massey puts forth. And then there's the investor Jeffrey Burns, who is the CEO of Blockchains LLC, who until I think just about this month was planning to develop his own blockchain innovation park on a plot of land in the Nevada desert that he purchased. And they were aiming to create a corporate structure that was a distributed collaborative entity using blockchain for small tech corporations to govern their own spatial zones that were separate from the city or the state. And they literally called this Sandbox City. And to implement this, Burns was actually donating a good sum of money to various political action committees of the Nevada governor and assembly members. But because of ongoing hesitation and opposition, Burns seems to be pulling out of this project. But was one case in which he actually did engage architects to do the designs and renderings and sort of master plan. There's other examples of how this Smart City 2.0 proposal might work, usually spearheaded by figureheads. For example, Acoin, the Akon city with the singer Akon in Senegal, in partnership with the local government. But sometimes, and this is where I'll focus, blockchain and crypto involvement in urban development is not as straightforward as a singular unified smart city development, and more about complex relationships that form in the case of Puerto Rico, which is actually how I came to this topic of crypto about 4 years ago when I was in Puerto Rico doing hurricane recovery work after Maria and Irma, Hurricanes Maria and Irma. So what's happening? Well, due to recent tax incentives, formerly Acts 20, now Act 60, 2021, new tax incentives for crypto investments and blockchain businesses have cropped up, and a number of mainly white male crypto enthusiasts from the US, but elsewhere as well, have moved to Puerto Rico. And a subset have very explicitly stated that they intend to create their own crypto-utopia, dubbed Puertopia, as I mentioned, Brock Pierce. But the kicker on top of this is the tax incentives are not available to local Puerto Ricans. So it brings up the question, right? Who is Puerto Rico for, and who has the right to decide? Brock Pierce and his friends have called the island a blank slate where they can start over from scratch and populate it with their friends. But of course, Puerto Rico is not starting over from scratch. It's been subject to over 500 years of colonialism, first Spanish, then United States, arguably now United States, and now crypto. And it's not just outside interests. There's local Puerto Ricans and members of the government who are invested in maintaining their status, aligned with these techno-libertarian aims. Puerto Rico is also in a debt crisis. So the economic development corporations leveraging blockchain for economic development, and that aligns with existing neoliberal governance measures, which I wrote about in an article for Design and Culture called Blockchains and the Chains of Empire. The geography of San Juan is increasingly distributed with these crypto locales that are associated with blockchain or crypto. From tech accelerators to restaurants that host blockchain happy hours and more. But beyond, there's also covert digital platforms where crypto colonization is taking place through the STO, the security token offering, that one could buy into if you knew that this launch was happening. And this is somewhat of an enclave, but a distributed one, with key office buildings in Old San Juan, but even a farm in Las Marias, where food was intended to be sold with prioritized access for this new crypto community. And so while there might not be necessarily physical walls gating off this crypto utopia in San Juan, there's clear digital walls and gates that keep anybody out from investing unless you're a high net worth investor and on the inside. So this brings me to the broader definition of crypto-colonialism that I'm putting forth, which is the act of coordinated groups of individuals leveraging their wealth to settle in and exploit lands and laws favorable towards continued crypto interests and activities. And it has many relations to the historic symptoms of colonialism we see playing out in new ways, including settler colonialism, replacing the population with a new advanced population, extractive colonialism, so placing demands on a land's natural resources or infrastructure, and also experimenting on a group of people, converting people into advanced citizens under the guise of education, often intentionally underplaying the risks or the hiding the risks of participating or not giving them a chance to opt out. So in terms of extraction, right, crypto is placing a huge demand on Puerto Rico's already vulnerable electricity infrastructure. So while most people aren't mining from rigs located in Puerto Rico, but are part of mining pools elsewhere, many Puertopians are Bitcoin maximalists and are kind of complicit in these energy demands. Although I guess the numbers can be debated these days. When I did this figure, The projection in Digiconomist calculated the carbon emissions produced in one Bitcoin transaction was roughly equivalent to driving about 4 round trips around the entire main island of Puerto Rico. So that's something to be said, especially when hospitals are left without power after summer storms, ongoing hurricanes, but the crypto hotels in San Juan are fine. I should note Puerto Rico has been historically a test bed for US nuclear technologies, war technologies, and viajes, and more. But even more obvious is what's happening as well in El Salvador with the Bitcoin beach experiment and the Bitcoin payment rollouts, and under the president's adoption of Bitcoin as a nationally accepted currency. On the surface, it looks like the locals are leading the charge as a grassroots effort, but in reality, with this particular project, certainly benefiting a small group of technologists and venture capitalists from the states, pulling the strings to institute certain techno fixes that they can profit from, which is a lesson I'd venture Brock Pierce learned from the pushback that he received from activists in Puerto Rico. He was also a consultant to the El Salvador government and the Bitcoin beach developers. So I'll just leave this figure here. Any opposition or calls to slow down and question what is happening are often dismissed as standing in the way of progress. But I think we do need to do that. Which brings me to the question that I'll follow up with, which is blockchain, if it is just a technical tool, can it be used for decolonization? What's its actual utility? What's its use? Inevitably, the answer is going to have local specificity. So back to Puerto Rico, can you decolonize money? Well, many Puerto Rican activists might argue that the US dollar in and of itself is a symbol of colonization. But at the end of the day, any alternate currency has to be usable. This was an interesting proposal back in 2018, Coqui Cash, which is meant as a community-based cryptocurrency to be used by local businesses in exchange for goods and services, but it never really took off. The problem was mainly the people this was geared towards, lifelong Puerto Rican residents, both are skeptical of cryptocurrency because they see the phenomena that's happening, but also the digital divide is real. So especially in rural areas, Puerto Rico is still primarily a cash-based economy. The credit cards haven't even really rolled in. Now, I'll pose an example as an explicit alternate to Bitcoin. This project, Valor y Cambio, Value and Change, was started by Puerto Rican scholars who proposed a new paper-based currency that also challenged the notion of value. Okay, rather than financial, users would record a short message about what they value in life and would be rewarded with these paper pesos with famous Puerto Rican activists on them that they could exchange at a number of local businesses. This happened both in Puerto Rico and in the New York City diaspora in East Harlem and Loisaida. Two, Puerto Rico has a long history of social and environmental justice. Organizations from community-run solar microgrids to food sovereignty movements. And they also have a really incredibly strong and supportive diaspora. And so there is potential and also a need to connect these movements in a mutually supportive network. But the way that distributed ledgers or DAOs currently incentivize individual competition or consider value as purely profit-oriented, maybe that's not what we're looking for. But does that mean blockchain's incompatible? Well, there's definitely outside tech companies landing in PR. So Renovato PR, looking to transform the archipelago to the next Silicon Valley of the fintech industry or the Caribbean. But there are also local Puerto Rican startups and entrepreneurs looking critically at the blockchain space who are more community oriented, like Link PR. And they realize that education and digital literacy is a huge first step. Also, in terms of leveraging existing incentives for local Puerto Ricans rather than outsiders, there are some legal acts that can benefit particularly young Puerto Ricans and local startups to align with this new techno-economic shift. And many of them relate to Puerto Rico's long and successful history with economic cooperativism. So there is a strong cooperative network from credit unions to workers' co-ops in Puerto Rico. And some organizations are turning attention to the platform cooperative model to see how digital technology can improve either administrative processes or decision-making. And really, platform cooperativism provides an alternative to also venture capital funding and encourages democratic design by giving participants real decision-making power and ownership. So it follows the Rochdale 7 cooperative principles and aligns with Eleanor Ostrom's 8 principles of the commons. But for example, successful platform co-ops that have been established around the world include alternates to extractive ride-sharing platforms like Uber, which would be quite relevant and important for Puerto Rico because Uber is the dominant ride-sharing platform. Or even alternates to crowdfunding platforms like GoFundMe, I suppose. Something like that would be really powerful in mobilizing the diaspora after hurricane. But we have to ask, because of the outside interest and colonial activity surrounding cryptocurrency, many Puerto Ricans might be oppositional or suspect to blockchain as the underlying technology. But if something like cooperativism was the entry point, rather than giving any one technology the starting point, perhaps this distributed organizations could take off. It would definitely have challenges for sure. And Xavier will definitely bring some of those up in his particular presentation. But there's interest here in designing the policy frameworks in Puerto Rico to set it up as a potential alternative or contestation to the phenomena of colonization that's currently occurring. And that's where my current work lies. And we'll be writing more about that. But I'm going to end with, I suppose, a quote from Disco Manifesto, which is a group trying to get distributed ledgers to intersect with cooperativism. They say solidarity and commons-based projects need to assess what specific values and affordances are encoded into the available algorithms before rushing to adopt FOMO-induced blockchain solutions to assert themselves and foster healthy, mutually respectful collaborations in the DLT space. So that's all to say that there have been many longstanding feminist and grassroots groups in Puerto Rico that have been cooperatively organizing. I suggest you start here to learn more. But again, perhaps we consider digital technology as a tool that follows values rather than the value proposition in and of itself. So with that, I will leave it. And I know that intersects well with Xavier's presentation on what happens when a co-op model is actually implemented or tested with blockchain. So, thank you for listening. And again, pose questions in the chat. Oh.
All right, so should I share my presentation then?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you, Jillian.
Can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So welcome everyone to my presentation entitled Digital Commoning and Post-Capitalist Crypto Economies, the Case of FairCoin in Practice. And so as Carla pointed out at the beginning, I'm in general interested in how grassroots innovations are performing alternative economies with degrowth-oriented values. Inte and Jillian just gave a brilliant bird's eye view on the different logics, narratives of blockchain and tokens. And I will give a more in-depth look into the specific case of FairCoin. So I will present my findings on the research that I've been doing as part of my PhD in the last few years to tell the story of FairCoin and FairCoin, which have been experimenting with digital exchanges using software in different ways to the current platform economy and the big tech model. I will also present some of the challenges that these initiatives face, such as the risky entanglement with crypto markets, transparency, and management issues, as well as personal burnouts. So just to give you some context, the region of Catalonia in Spain is widely considered to be an area with a rich history of social movements and self-organized practices, including cooperativism and alternative economies. Just to give you an idea, between 1850s and the 1950s, there are more than 2,150 recorded alternative or complementary currencies in Catalonia. And since the crisis of 2008 and the lack of trust in the banking system that Inte mentioned, new alternative economic practices emerged that were trying to showcase these community-based and local economies. And many of these practices have been linked to the context of poverty, unemployment, and inequality generated in the 2008 financial crisis. One of the practices that I've been researching is that of alternative currencies. FairCop emerged in 2014, inspired by ideas of economic and technological sovereignty, autonomous organization, and cooperativism. Here we saw activists and hackers from cooperativist Catalan movements that they started collaborating with peers from other countries. And this resulted in an international movement that aimed to expand and scale up the political practices of the Catalan alternative currencies, which had been based at a more local level. So at the center of FairCop is the cryptocurrency called FairCoin, which has some unique features. First of all, it is designed in the spirit of a radical commons as a post-capitalist tool, which rejects the constant need for profit. They very much define themselves as trying to build post-capitalist tools, believing in the commons, transparency and solidarity, which very much links to what Inte was talking about, blockchain for social good. So FairCoin has also a politically motivated blockchain technology that revolves around an algorithm that aims to reflect those values of cooperation and community building. So whereas in Bitcoin, the very design of its proof of work algorithm requires an intense computational capacity for all of the calculations needed for every transaction, and this results in a humongous huge of electricity. And contrary to this, FairCoin has a proof of cooperation algorithmic concept that requires less calculations for validation and a peer-to-peer consensus mechanism that translates into a less energy-intense blockchain. And this is why they also define themselves as ecological and connected to these sustainability values. And then, last but not least, FairCoin was designed to be oriented towards being used regularly, so kind of rejecting this speculative move of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So the idea was really that it would be used amongst communities in order to foster social and ecological exchanges. Here you can see the chart of FairCop with FairCoin at its center. So aside from the use of the cryptocurrency, they really tried to develop a veritable post-capitalist financial structure, where they would also provide banking services with a so-called Bank of the Commons, where you can use a multi-currency wallet in FairCoin, Euros, and Bitcoin. Other services included Get FairCoin to purchase FairCoin, or Fair Funds, which coordinated donations to the global south, very much in this spirit of trying to decolonize through blockchain. And they are organized in local autonomous groups called nodes, which have their own assemblies, but then participate in the general meetings. So perhaps a quick note on methods. So what informs this particular presentation, based on ethnographic qualitative methods such as participant observation. And I was able to talk and to have multiple interviews with activists, hackers, and developers from all over the world that were collaborating in this project. And of course, informal conversations, as well as access to many of these spaces, were very crucial to understand the functioning of these alternative economies. And not only that, but I was lucky enough to visit some of these sites where these activists are carrying out these digital commons, such as FairSpot in Greece, Cooperativa de Central in Switzerland, or the Cooperativa Transparent and Calafó in Catalonia. So against the backdrop of big tech and platform capitalism, The digital commons have been posited as an alternative, particularly in relation with current issues of data-driven surveillance and platform monopolies. So I'm using the theoretical framework of commoning for looking at these case studies. And this is also no coincidence. Terms such as commons, post-capitalism, and degrowth is also part of the language and practice of this activist cryptocurrency. The historian Peter Linebaugh was the first one that really turned the noun common into the verb commoning, highlighting that its very essence is not a mere theoretical concept, but an active process which requires performance. So I draw on Massimo De Angeli's work on commoning, where he understands the commons as a social system that needs to be constantly reproduced. So in this sense, communities developing technologies that put mutual aid, cooperation, community trust, and decentralization at the center of their endeavors really speak to De Angelis' conception of commoning as an active process that aims to construct systems contesting capital. And then I'm equally interested in practice theory, which is going to help us to understand the daily and routinized type of behavior that constitutes these collectives. And so I ask, how is the reproduction of the selected digital commoning projects practiced? So first of all, we might ask, who really cooperated in this colossal endeavor of developing a new cryptocurrency that would challenge traditional capitalist financial market? And the answer is, these were activists, blockchain enthusiasts, and hackers from countries such as Greece, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, England, Serbia, Brazil, just to name a few. And aside from being connected digitally, summer meetups and hackathons would take place every year in different countries. So this would not only be online communities, but would very much remain connected outside of the screen. And here down below, you see a screenshot from the tool Mapo, which is an interactive map that shows the exact location and businesses that accept FairCoin as a method of payment. And as you can see, it's mostly concentrated in Europe, but it had projects accepting it in many countries around the world. However, after a few years of relative success and scaling up, the use of FairCoin came into a halt. A project that at some point was moving millions of euros in value went into a crisis, and there's almost no activity today. And I will try to explain why I think this happened. So one of the main issues that puzzled activists and users of FairCoin was its unique double price model. FairCoin was at some point listed in cryptocurrency exchange platforms such as Vindax, Freevision, Bittrex, or Blocknet. This basically meant that you could purchase FairCoin in the same way you can purchase any other currency in crypto markets. However, this showed to have some important instability, as it meant that this new community currency was subject to the volatility of the crypto markets. So in order to protect themselves, they decided to have two prices, one for the internal assembly and another one that would be in the crypto market exchanges. So this would be a way of protecting merchants and users against the volatility of cryptocurrency exchanges. Think of a farmer of tomatoes that might have to change the price of their produce every day, depending on the instability of the crypto prices. So this is why they decided to, as a collective, have an internal stable price in FairCoin that would be 1.2 euros. But this was created a significant dissonance, as in these platforms, you could at some point buy FairCoin at 0.05 cents a piece. And that, of course, started generating some troubles. Now, the issue of double pricing here is a very complex economic experiment that I'm not going to fully explain here. And that if you're more interested, the paper of Dalling and Franzel has an in-depth analysis on this. But I want to point out at something else here. And that is that almost every person I spoke to pointed to the tensions, the internal discussions, the opacity and lack of proper communication as key to understand disillusionment, not so much this issue of double pricing. So Guy, who was very active within the FairCop community, said, quote, "The real issue was that we could not agree on how to fix it, and there was loads of conflict. It became polarized, and I became disillusioned from it." Sebas, who at some point was spokesperson for FairCop, said, quote, "All of this comes from the human aspects of things. because we could have solved these tensions between internal and external markets, but people were fighting with each other with very different visions. The interviewees also alleged a worrying opacity in the accounts, particularly in the number of euros that existed to convert back to FairCoin. And the fact that these euros ran out of money is not a mere economic problem. Rather, it demonstrates a human failure of communicating, as well as practicing the transparency and solidarity that this experiment claimed to take as founding principles. So FairCop and FairCoin really state the importance of transparency, democracy, and horizontal decision-making. As a collective with an anarchist and self-organized principles, this is very important to them. And the algorithm of FairCoin, as well as the meetings of local nodes and the general assemblies, demonstrate efforts towards democratic governance. In another paper, that of Gerhardt, it's even been celebrated as an example of radical democracy. However, upon closer investigation, this was not a shared sentiment amongst most of its participants. So an anonymous person that was also very active said, quote, "At the end of the day in FairCoin, who decided its price at the assembly was its founder," end quote. Another, who would later be crucial in the development of Común, that I will explain later about, claimed, quote, "One of the main problems was the centralization of the project in the figure of its founder and the creation of factions." So many active participants in FairCoin pointed out to me that they felt an important level of opacity and centralization. I guess what I want to stress out here is that even if digital commoning implies moving the conversation to the sphere of the digital and the technological, we ought to be very wary that its foundation is made up of humans and fallible commoners, not paying attention to difficult issues such as who has more space in assemblies, who can actually edit the code, who has access to the accounts, and having mechanisms to balance them, I think is actually doing a disfavor to commoning projects. But I don't want to just point an ultra negative light on this project, because despite a general sense of disappointment in relation to the aforementioned issues, I was really surprised to hear how almost every activist and developer involved still maintained the sense of hope and potential in the ideas of FairCoin. The hope that FairCoin generated put in touch many activists and hackers, and from this experience, several projects have been developed. And here I will just very briefly talk about two that got my attention, and those are Común and Kaana. So Común really stemmed out of people that were very active in FairCoin, and it emerged as a collective that provides training for other collectives and social movements on training in regards to privacy and security, open software, blockchain technologies, alternative economies, and decentralized electronic currencies. And they also have Telegram chats with hundreds of daily participants sharing information, books, and all sorts of documentation, which makes it a very lively online community. And the new project of Kaana is trying to reactivate FairCoin in the town of Arbúcies in Catalonia. So rather than having this ambitious idea of trying to create an international cryptocurrency, they are now trying to generate their own fork of FairCoin and reactivating it in this one town. And they're looking to activate it in several businesses. And the mayor has even expressed the will to pay part of the salaries of the town hall workers in FairCoin, which would be really something unprecedented. So the strategies put forward by these two projects demonstrate that the networking, the work, and the ideas put forward by FairCop are far from being stagnant. Despite the issues of management and hierarchies, these new forms of digital commoning have learned from the experiences of FairCoin and are moving its ideas and practices forward in novel ways. So now I'm going to move on to more broad discussion ideas. I hope it comes across that my aim is not so much to deconstruct and expose the examples of FairCoin as failed exercises in establishing authority. On the contrary, my motivation is grounded in an empathetic critique that aims to complicate predominant understandings of alternative markets and platforms. I think that not engaging with difficult questions is, in my view, doing a disfavor to alternative platforms, particularly in times of mounting surveillance, algorithmic governance, and digital market logics. There's a book that has been quite influential for my work, and you can see it here on the right, and is that of Adam Greenfeld's book called Radical Technologies, where technological innovations and its political economic motivations and consequences are meticulously explained. And my critical perspective on digital commoning is here mirrored by Greenfeld's analysis on the rise and fall of the distributed autonomous organizations, or DAOs, which we've already been talked about. So when analyzing the DAO with a commons perspective, Greenfeld admits to have seen some of the most dedicated community activists he has ever met. Yet he concludes that the DAO was never really built for commoning. It is a sober reminder that, quote, activists on the participatory left are just as easily captivated by technological hype as anyone else, especially when that hype is couched in superficially appealing language, end quote. So when looking at technologies and its connection to the common, Greenfield asserts that the capacity that any technology has for enacting transformative change is yet to be proven. He says, quote, these discussions are always couched in terms of their potential, what might happen, what could be achieved. Nobody has yet shown what a distributed autonomous organization has done so, end quote. And in a similar vein, the project of FairCoin has been presented in academic works as in a very positive light, constantly highlighting its potential for the commons and post-capitalism. Even Michael Bowens, who is the founder of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, has even praised it as an example of post-capitalist exchange. However, far from wanting to undermine the well-intended efforts of scholars and academics, I also wanted to shed light on the tensions and inconsistencies in order to fully analyze what such projects have done and where there are still challenges. De Angelis has argued that capitalist and/or statist circuits secretes capitalist values, and that the production of the commons secretes commons values. However, this is, in my view, a rather binary perspective, one that tends to portray a black and white picture of what the commons and capital are. And it thus bears the question, are commoning practices not ever hierarchical or have deficient feedback mechanisms? And if so, are they just not commoning? So when it comes to engagement with digital commoning platforms, scholars tend to also glorify these, especially considering the data-driven and platform capitalism context where we're at. However, the real challenge that I feel is lacking in this debate is really how ideas and values such as peer-to-peer, transparency, decentralization, and the commons, which sound very good, but how are they rendered into practices in regards to technologies? So I thus argue that focusing on the performative process on the common, that is the act of commoning, allows us to still engage with such alternatives without falling into the romanticization of such proposals. And I also call, together with other colleagues, of course, for a less black and white theory of technology, where we either see big tech and surveillance versus digital commons. I think that in organizing alternative platforms, we should consider not only that the technical aspect matters, but also the social ones. And this is perhaps connected to this particular example, but maybe this is a good question for now our discussion. And at least from my research up to now, I can say that the potential of blockchain to enact radical change is yet to be demonstrated. So thank you very much. I will now stop sharing my slides, and the floor is open, I guess, for questions and discussions.
Thank you very much, Javier. I wanted to just check if there are new questions popping up. But I guess I have a few things while we're waiting for some questions to pop up from the attendees. Thank you so much for the incredible body of work you've shown today, because it just goes into so much detail and depth. It's really rewarding for me to find the discussion placed already in these areas in such detail. I have a lot of questions that I'm personally interested in, and Thank you, Javier, for also, in that end, tell us whether you agreed or not with Adam Greenfield's, suggestion, because it has some years, and it's always important every year to check on, do we have, do we agree with that stance that it's still very much about potential and idealization, rather than understanding really whether there has been something measurable. And that problem of what can be measured, I think it's at the core of this, like, how do we measure? Can potential itself be a performative aspect? So for instance, can idealization, dreaming, the workup of the process itself, so the organization of something, I think that's a question that I would pose you, the three of you. I have a few other things, but this is, I think, an important one that was just somehow posed. Can the processes themselves that start to create commons be themselves a measure, a measure of that, a performance that we would aim for? Or are there other measurements that we would be wanting to, or like, let's say, the emergence of a real model of a governance that then would have some level of stability, or the measurement of a series of new types of exchanges of cultures? Like, how would we create some kind of guideline or criteria to say that, oh, we have observed a change that was made that we can point at? Maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
So if I understand it, there's two questions at play. One is, can we leverage the hype of the potential and still and not necessarily focus on the potential, but in actual processes to create new frameworks or protocols for cases that would give us that example to actually enact and have a pivotal change, or have an example that makes a pivotal change? Well, I mean, from my perspective, I'm probably one of those academics that uses FairCoin as the one positive outcome as a actually implemented project that got something off the ground. And I do think it did make a pivotal change. Whether or not it is without fault is, clearly still to be discussed and determined. But even if there's small incremental changes in a positive direction, I think that is a good move forward, just because in the design of any technological device or tool, the people who are building these tools and shaping them are the ones that are encoding their own logics and ideologies and dreams into them. So it's one of those questions, like you always see, can you influence positive change within the system, or are you going to let that happen elsewhere and try to fight for change outside of the system? I think it's challenging. It depends on how we see blockchain as a device, as a technological tool. I do think that I wonder, this is maybe my own personal perspective, and I know you and I have talked about this before, which is the technical apparatus of a blockchain tends to prioritize individual kind of atomization and incentivization for the individual rather than the collective. And when you implement it in a collective way, the messiness that Javier was bringing up on the kind of infighting that happens about how do you make the collective decisions, that's where the dreams or the ideas about a potential technological institution that is devoid of human messiness, that's where it collapses, right? I don't know if you have any other comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's often like the ideals are there, but humans tend to mess things up. is definitely a problem that comes in with blockchain, especially because it wants so desperately to leave behind the messiness, corruptibility, fallibility of humans. But yeah, I was also thinking about the question more generally, like, and when I was talking about blockchain for good, and then I heard Xavier talk about FairCoin. I was thinking like the examples that I brought up were definitely very different from FairCoin and much more, even though I would put them under the same header, there is a different intention with, DM than with FairCoin. Quite oppositional, perhaps. And that's what it comes down to, I think, is also like, it's not about the technology, it's about who is building it and what do they want and how are they connected outside of that blockchain system. Do these people know each other or not? Do they meet each other or not? And if the blockchain has any use, it's in I think it's really to facilitate things outside of it, to facilitate social interactions and cooperatives, for example. That's where I see like potential to actually make a change when there are people that actually already do things and just need a technical thing to help them out to make things smoother or more decentralized, for example.
Yeah, I guess, Carla, to your question of measurements, after listening to your question, I started thinking of the overarching question of this biennale of how do we live together. And I think that if we want to measure, like in terms of guidelines of whether or not some blockchain initiatives are being successful or not, thinking of whether or not it is bringing community members together might be a start. And this is why I also don't want to just portray the case of FairCoin as an ultimate failure either, because sure, it experimented with in a very ambitious way, and some things worked, some others didn't, but it also connected a bunch of people and communities worldwide. I was able to pay a round of beers in FairCoin in Switzerland and buy some coffee in Athens. And that is not something that happens every day. And a lot of these connections are already made. And as I showed, it has generated further projects. So I also don't want to say here I agree with Inte, perhaps there is some potential after all in terms of like in cooperativist and decentralized way. But I also think that at times we as researchers or as activists that are concerned with the way in which the digital economy is just taking over pretty much every facet of our lives, commodifying every so further, that whenever we see an alternative, we tend to celebrate it. And I think we also need to be a bit wary, even when it comes from grassroots movements, of really how is it actually enacted on the ground? What are the narratives that are behind those? And are those narratives actually being practiced? Because if not, we might be, selling the same smoke from a grassroots movements that we might, Facebook might be doing when they say they care for us. And and I just think we need further engagement and further research and more initiatives, because obviously this technology is here to stay.
Yeah, I want to build off of that comment, Xavier, that you're asking, how can we lean into the idea about connection rather than what blockchain might or currently do, which is anonymize, individualize, fragment humans to an address or chain. And maybe an example within decentralized networks or ledgers is the different cases and the different uses of decentralized social networks, right? As particularly cropping up as an alternative to the centralization and the corporatization of organizations like Facebook, for example. And as we've seen pragmatically, might be quite useful as a way when the servers are down, you know, as a decentralized network, then you can still remain connected. And it is about, it depends now though, because you look at decentralized networks and you're thinking about, well, you know, Steemit is very different than something like Mastodon ideologically. One is much more about community interests and creating discussions amongst users with similar interests. The other is about, you know, generating currency and via how many likes you get on a post. And so I think those are interesting areas to explore. I see Oshani was in here earlier, one of my research collaborators. So hopefully we can, you know, engage more of the research in that area. But yeah, there's also a question or a series of questions in the chat by Eric.
Yes.
Carla, if you want to jump into those.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think we can all read it, but there's several questions in there by Eric, actually. I guess, I mean, I'm interested in all of them. I also was interested in the fact that when we were talking about your responses just now pointed to the mutability of also community making, but also the mutability of identity. So we are not also identities that belong only to a particular envelope, right? We work as layers. I think it's very difficult for any of us right now as human beings to say we're very well in this envelope and we'll stay there forever. And I think that also points to the fact that we have to think about perhaps these models in a different way in terms of how they themselves evolve because they learn, and then learn with the intelligence, of course, of the members, which have their own mutability. There's a few questions I wanted to ask about that, but I would like to address the questions by Eric. So Eric is talking about the expense in Curitiba in Brazil, about the liquidity of the city, the fact that it had to sometimes shift, or at least, there we go, absorb, integrate alternative currencies as a way of continuing to perform certain services. But I think mainly the question has to do with the ways in which there are always speculation activity or markets that feed off from what are initially relationships and basically currencies and activities that start on a community basis. Perhaps you guys could respond to that. Especially interested that it's very connected to urbanism, the source of this question.
I will just try to address the question of whether or not there are mechanisms to help to mitigate the secondary speculation market. I know within the community of FairCop there was a group that really tried to create a fork of it to try to really mitigate this. So it is in a way possible. I'm not sure technically how to manage, but I can put you on it if you're interested, Eric. But basically, the cat was already out of the box and they could only put some of it back. And this is the danger of it, is that in a way, just like any of us here might be able to trade oranges with each other, who's telling us that we cannot just trade them with someone else at a different price? And this is what happens when we all agree on something, but then we can still post it on another market. And this is exactly what happens when we have the issue of double pricing, is that we can have an agreement on an assembly, but then it's so easy to put it on a crypto market elsewhere and just sell it. Who's going to forbid me to sell something? So I don't really have a clear answer to this, because so far the story of cryptocurrencies is the story of speculation. And even FairCoin, that really tried to challenge this as much as they could, they still sort of got into real trouble with this double pricing thing. So I'm not really sure there are any mechanisms out there that are just the silver bullet solution.
Yeah, that is tricky. I think, and I can't list any cases, but in the consideration of a project that considers the coin or the token as a token that isn't traded on a secondary market. So for example, the token has the voting right, 1 vote per entity or per person in a cooperative model could work, and in which case you have to be a member of the cooperative to own tokens, but the use, it can still be used, and the services can be used by outsiders. Now, in terms of like injecting liquidity, that wouldn't be the case there. That would be something else. But yeah, you're right in that often injecting liquidity into an illiquid market is one of the main aims of tokenizing certain systems. Like, for example, the STO in the real estate market, that's exactly what their value proposition is. But you know, when I'm thinking about STOs that are meant to democratize access to housing, for example, that, for example, with you know, people of color who have been systemically prevented from getting traditional loans through traditional banks, that, you know, seems like a great alternative, but are we still replicating systems of, you know, problematic systems in terms of who can buy into these? Yeah, it's a challenge.
I don't know if Inte,
No,
do you want to answer? Yes.
I think
Yeah.
this was answered really well by Jillian and Xavier already. Yeah, I was thinking in the last part of Xavier's presentation, you were talking about this kind of, you said something like, you know, even, you know, left activists are swayed by the narrative, and I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, way of putting it, and yeah, that really got me thinking about like this, the way the last projects that I was showing, this kind of Terra Zero cybernetic forest or self-owning forest, and this Oblomo, how we have to find ways to cut through the narrative and to be more honest about, even if that is like showing the downsides of it, but that it seems like we're hardly ever really talking about like blockchain without all the stories around it, and that makes it so difficult to really get to the meat of it. But yeah, that I just a thought that came up when you were talking about that as well, and how maybe that's kind of framed my interest with these kind of what I called theoretical project as well. Like maybe that's the core. Like maybe they try to be more honest in a way. Yeah.
I guess I'll use the fact that we have time to ask more questions. I don't know if the audience has more, but while they're perhaps writing them up, this is a really, really fascinating discussion for me. There's just so much to pick. So there's so many. I'm reminded of, for instance, the example of Accelerando by Charles Stross, where basically a main character at some point is navigating a city and he chooses where to go based on where he can enter and what he can buy. That is just, he doesn't work with profit or currency or service anymore. The way in which he acts in the world and the ways in which he distributes the knowledge outcoming from his experience as a particular type of consultant drives where he can move, where he can walk, what he can eat, where the affiliations are. But what is interesting is that is constantly shifting. So he lives on charity, supposedly, on donations, and he has a wallet. And this was before, it was based on the idea of credit that has always existed in science fiction. But of course, that right now we can kind of almost associate that with an idea of a pay in a crypto coin. Not exactly the same thing, but it's been there as an idea. And the interesting part of the description of that example is that character is moving through a very kind of a highly shifting environment. So the affiliations he has are constantly shifting, both in terms of place, but also one assumes ideological. So where he has worked more and with according to what was needed. And so there's this constant change that is associated with that navigation of how a credit is given by a service of expertise and what it associates itself with politically, culturally, socially, and then urbanistically speaking in that case. But what I wanted to bring up with this is we also tend to look at what's good and bad in terms of these structures in an absolute way. So what seems in an absolute way structurally good, that it is going to create certain kinds of cultures or communities and not others. And I wonder if there's also a kind of a part in all of your research that deals with the problem of the circumstantial and the time span and the lifespan of some ideas as they might help structure others. So for instance, the way in which even the mode in which locality, the character of a locality or of a community might change because of its individuals, or the way in which networks by themselves tend to be alocal, therefore they might connect individuals that are in different localities, and therefore their character of locality, the locality of the network might be extremely different from a geography or even from an ethnicity or change. I mean, the Philippines are always given as that example since the 90s of like the diaspora being more conservative than the Philippines that stayed in the country. And I'm just wondering if space is changing and cultures are changing, and I wonder how we think about this idea of the structure for good in the context of the highly circumstantial, and also the need for mutability and change itself coming from the changing world we have that we know is going to happen. So for instance, how these mechanisms can actually deal with rapid change and accept that rapid change might also be just a very strong aspect of how they come literally and go into the scene to adapt to, again, a particular event, for instance.
Well, I might jump in here because this is something that I've been grappling in my work in Puerto Rico, which is local grassroots and activist groups have been working towards certain issues like food sovereignty, sustainable community microgrids, for example. The work has been slow and it's been long-standing and very human oriented. And here, to contrast, you have the kind of technocratic speed that is being afforded to people who know how to code, for example, and who can implement projects in a very quick time frame and maybe get something off the ground in a way that connects with local governments or doesn't, kind of circumvents involvement there, and can implement a project very quickly and get that off the ground. So there is a need for speed, and especially after climactic disasters, the ongoing crises, when the status quo is crisis in Puerto Rico. But it does open the question, is there now a timescale or like a speed that is afforded to a kind of technocratic citizen who is able to have certain tools at their disposal to implement a project? And I would say, yeah, there is. And what does that mean does it mean that we have to bring grassroots organizations up to speed, so to say, or is it a combination, a hybrid, where you're leveraging the great things that come out of a slowness of sitting with problems for a long time and coming up with solutions that are using, tools at hand, and balancing that with the affordability that the technological tool allows. So it does go to and what you were talking about in the distribution of knowledge, it's a challenging issue where the argument around code space is that, you know, people who are who can code have a certain capacity, and maybe there will be a time where we all that knowing how to code is just a second language to us. We're not there yet, and we're not there with particularly areas that the digital divide is very real, where there's not reliable broadband internet infrastructure. So I guess hypothetically, if we situate ourselves in a speculative future in which we're all evened out and code is a second language, then I think we would be able to have a more nuanced discussion about who has the power and can different projects emerge from that knowledge, but that base knowledge might not be afforded to everybody right now. That's the way I took your question, but I'm sure there's many different ways like Accelerando to enter that question. So I leave it open to my colleagues.
I'll bring up one thing because I think it helps to specify also. I'm very interested from all your presentations, and then also because of how they resonate with some of my interests. I'm very interested in the problem of catching up itself. The fact that the coming up to speed, so that's why FairCoin is such a great example, it will always be present. It will be the problem of secondary education, will be the problem of massive education. It is, it will always be the idea itself of education, that we finally see it as a problem of catching up, but the fact that we will never catch up to what gets to where we should be is the reason for education. It's the drive, and it's so interesting, I think, for this particular, I don't even want to call it technology, but it's new reality to catch up to it too. So I'm wondering how that, you know, I was thinking about utopias about catching up, utopias that live or or create as a kind of a priority that problem could be an interesting idealization as well, because it will always be there. It's very pragmatic. Oh, you muted, Jillian.
Sounds like, sorry?
It's just that Jillian was talking, but she was muted. But Inte, go ahead.
No, yeah, it sounds almost like a kind of a need for a modular solution or something that could take away the need to know it all or something and to understand it all, but that could be applied in different spaces more easily, more directly. And I think that a lot of the projects that we've talked about, like, we are in a moment where it's still they are more kind of singular front runners sometimes, but maybe over time we can see them as part of a more of a trend and something that becomes more formalized if we find something that actually, you know, has a positive impact and can be useful in different places. And maybe their you know, small scale could be the answer also, because that is often what makes things difficult to want to be global and big, the way I see it anyway.
I think from my perspective, this is something that the this mysticism that Inte was talking about, this kind of crypto-utopianism, for me links with neoliberal logics, which is based on the fact that once we all have the necessary information to be informed persons within the market, then it will all even out, right? But I just feel that this idea of blockchain, which is essentially democratic because it's decentralized, that therefore it will lead to powerless structures, I don't necessarily agree with that vision, because we are seeing right now how after already several years of you know, crypto economy being developed, how those intermediaries exist. They are not the classic bankers that we used to know, but they are, hacker enthusiasts. They are developers that speak a language that I literally cannot speak, which is that of complex code. So it has generated a new intermediaries, and so it's by no means I don't think going to generate like a classless society. So I think this is where I took this idea of kind of catching up, where I feel that a lot of this blockchain movement believes that, yeah, but once everyone's on the same train, then we can develop something really cool together. And I just don't think no one will ever be at the same train simultaneously. There will be somebody that is still the conductor and somebody that is just trying to catch it. And that is going to contribute to this kind of like stratification of society and proper power imbalances, I think.
Yeah, and I think it goes into like, where's that education being like disseminated from, to use a term that, yeah. But I think it's an idea right now where education around blockchain, around Bitcoin, around cryptocurrency is typically taught by the developers, by the already existing venture capitalists that are trying to promote their product in a certain region. So any education is limited or curated around the idea of creating a consumer, whether or not it's a literal consumer buying a product or somebody who will be using their service. And so I think we need to step back and couch education well, first around code in general, so that we can have the knowledge to decipher what computationally we can and cannot do in a coded system like this. And I'm trying to do it. It's just challenging to learn, but I'm happy to do it. But they're also in relationship to where the education is being like taught. Is it through, for example, a cooperative organization, which by law has to educate their members on what cooperativism means, and then in that case, they maybe have a more critical reading or teaching of what this is as a technological tool that may or may not be right for the project at all, versus something that is like a neoliberal kind of logic of we have to bank the unbanked, use the service, this is the utility, this is how you exchange a Bitcoin on your app through this exchange. Yeah, it's like, what exactly do we mean when we talk about education? That's my question. Yeah.
I was also thinking about the when you talked about language, and I'm reading this book. It's not related to blockchain, but I'm reading Cultish. It's about it's by Amanda Montell, who talks about like the cult, the languages or the language that cults use to kind of draw people in and kind of section them off from broader society, and how that also is used by like startups and all those kind of identity building companies. And this is definitely something that is so widespread in blockchain circles as well, that I often look at websites of blockchain startups, and I'm just puzzled by the language. Like I have to watch a video 3 times before I understand what they're saying, because it's so much this in-crowd language that kind of it once you get it, it becomes true, and it kind of it really becomes its own universe, and it's hard to talk about it in any other terms, but it's so inaccessible if you're on the outside.
Here we are just living off chain.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's also contributing to this whole kind of aura around it, that it's impenetrable.
Yeah, I was exactly wondering, just like, so that's really fascinating, the identity building language that associates with, basically proto-faith activities. Yes, very interesting. I was exactly wondering the in a speculative way, when promotion is towards creating consumers. Jillian, departing from your phrase, what would be the terms for what we want to create? So if it's not consumer, the Bitcoin wrangler that we would want to create, or the coin wrangler that we would want to create, what would be that? That would not be a consumer. It would be interesting to, if it would also be based on an identity that would be inspiring of what the attitude should be in relationship to that same chain, infrastructure, currency tool. Yeah, very, very interesting problems. Yeah, I was also, I think maybe we have a few more minutes. I was wondering, it is messy indeed, right? And maybe the messiness is perhaps welcome where we are right now. So the fact that, again, the envelopes are difficult to create, and I wouldn't want to quote necessarily Kevin Kelly on this, but the fact that he suggests that as soon as you are in a certain degree of a kind of a digital nativism, all questions have an answer. Yes. Can you do this or this? Yes. Can you do this or this? Yes. So should you do this or that? Yes to both. That the fact that it is possible to overlap, that the intersection is no longer a Boolean concept, either or, a logic operation of that kind, but it is it's more like a texture, or even again, a layering word. That's why the concept of the stack of layers of Benjamin Bratton for the networks we live in is so productive, because it assumes connections, but it does not create exclusivities, right? So there's something interesting about that. And I wonder if you also see it that way in your work. So do you see also that messiness of this kind of the conjoining of different models is productive in some way, or it's an emerging condition that has appeals to you personally? When they happen, if they happen. So the models being messed up.
I would say we need messiness, like if anything wants to be democratic, it has to be messy. And that is one of the fundamental problems with trying to do it on a blockchain. Because we need friction, we need discussion, we need things to be visible and breakable and changeable. So yeah, I hope for messiness, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, of course, this messiness is productive. The issue is whether or not we decide to try to understand everything that's happening in front of our eyes. And I think that there's a lot of people that kind of, they turn their heads around when the conversation turns into technology, into blockchain, into things that, my grandma would really struggle to understand. But I think the key here is not just to embrace this messiness, but kind of paraphrasing Donna Haraway, like really staying with the trouble, staying with this issue that we have in front of us, because it's likely to be a very crucial development into the digitalization of society. And we, the very least, need to stay with it to understand it and see in what ways we might harness some of its elements to transform society, or at least follow where it goes.
I think that's a great place to end, because I love that idea. I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, blockchain projects often tout an increased transparency, but in actuality, in our empirical research, we find very much the messiness is often hidden or swept under the rug of these layers of code. And it's the problem of the technology, not the problem of the protocol or the frameworks or the human imperfections and messiness. But like Xavier said, stay with the trouble, staying with the trouble. That's our aim.
All right. So I don't know if anyone in the audience has any other questions. But if not, maybe I'll wrap it up here because it is too good of a wrap up comment to mess it up. So thank you so much. I'm extremely grateful for this conversation. It's really, really wonderful. And there's so many other things I would love to continue, but we would need several more events. But thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And thank you for the great questions. And that's it. I hope everyone can continue to come also to the other events and kind of fold what's happening in these first events into the next ones and continue it that way. So thank you very much to the presenters. Thank you for the audience, and good luck for everyone on this messy environment.
Thanks so much, Carla. Thanks to everyone for coming, for sharing your Sunday with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.